Hey everyone. So today we are going to pick up with two of the chapters on love. And their kind of main point is how the aesthetic practice, which is your prayer life, your search for beauty, focusing on readings, all of those kind of practical things that we do. Is not kind of sufficient, in that we have to add, and that it only handles, the aesthetic practices only handle a very small amount of the passions, or only a very few passions, and you have to add spiritual contemplation. The last chapter that on love that we looked at was about how the purpose of the commandments, following the commandments, is to render simple our mental images. And then reading and contemplation is able to free the mind of mental impressions. And so this is furthering those two ideas. So I'm going to read you the two chapters on love, the two texts on love, and then from St. Maximus the Confessor. Remember, the chapters are coming from St. Maximus, and then the reflection is from Elder Emilianos of Simon Petara. I practiced that right before I did this, and I still don't think I did it right. Anyway, the way of aesthetic practice does not suffice by itself for the perfect liberation of the mind from the passions, so that it might be able to pray without distraction, unless such practice is succeeded by various spiritual contemplations. Aesthetic practices frees the mind only from licentiousness, hate, while spiritual contemplations rid it both of forgetfulness and ignorance. And in this way, the mind will be able to pray as it ought. Okay? So in kind of those two texts, again, the way of aesthetic practices does not give perfect liberation from the passions, so we can pray, unless it is succeeded by spiritual contemplation. So you have to do kind of both to get there. So your aesthetic practices frees the mind from licentiousness and hate, while spiritual contemplations rid it both of forgetfulness and ignorance, which is why I'm doing spiritual contemplations. And this is the way the mind ought to be able to pray as it should. Okay? So that is from the Confessor, and now we are about to read the reflection over that, and it's going to be laid out over about 6 pages. So here the Confessor continues the idea he introduced to us in the previous chapter, presenting it to us in a way that is simple and easy to understand. When he speaks of the mind being liberated from the passions, he is referring to the passions that affect the intelligible aspects of our soul, because there are other passions that affect our power of desire and anger, which the mind internalizes, since their reverberations and repercussions, we might say, reach to the level of mind and influences. But the passions that the mind primarily suffers from are more spiritualized passions, that is, intelligible passions that are more proper to the mind. Up to this point, you saw where the keeping of the commandments leads you, and where you are led by spiritual reading and contemplation. If you want your mind to be completely free of the passions, so that it is free of their impulses and movement, so that the mind does not incline to them, so that it contains no thought or mental image whatsoever, and completely dispassionate and unmoving with respect to the passions, then ascetic practice does not suffice. Ascetic practice consists largely of the keeping of the commandments. It is the human effort that we saw in the 4th chapter with the words, ascetic practice does not suffice. It is as if the Confessor is telling us, do not seek to prop yourself up based on the things that you do. Whatever you do will be human, and just as flesh will not inherit the kingdom of the heavens, neither will any of your human efforts. In order for your mind to be free of the passions, so that it might be able to attain a prayer that is undistracted, it is to rise to spiritual contemplations. This means that the grace of God must come in response to your effort and labors, to your ascetic practice, and thereby raise you up by means of contemplation, making you able to receive a spiritual life. To be sure, even a person adhering solely to the ascetic practices can experience spiritual contemplations because God loves everyone, and to everyone he gives forms of consolation. But to the same degree that spiritual reading and contemplations are more abundant, and to that same degree will one acquire greater purity, love, and a mind free of distractions. When you live a contemplative spiritual life and when your spirit is in a state of continual contemplation, your mind is never disturbed by distractions. But when you are living in the midst of your world, you struggle to find a few minutes to contemplate God, and afterwards you quickly fall back into the patterns and the routines of everyday life. The same can happen to a monk in the monastery. He too can become caught up in mundane activities and daily routines, just as people living in the world. Such a life is not necessarily sinful. It is simply the way life in the world is. This is why I have a succession of spiritual contemplations in my life. We all have a great need for inner spiritual experiences of God, of revelations given to us directly from God in a way that these revelations become something uniquely my own, something that I understand, which I recognize, and which I wholly possess and love. That is what it means for something to be mine. And in this case, what I love, possess, and understand and feel is obviously God himself. In this way, my life becomes bound up with the life of God. In the practical life, asceticism is of the utmost importance. Yet even through asceticism is a spiritual means to a spiritual end. It remains a virtue of the body. There are many differences and kinds of ascetic practice, such as the guarding of the mind. But this is purely an activity, an exercise. It is not an element of the spiritual life. It is something that by itself is incomplete. It is something that takes the place of the level of human effort. Asceticism is not an end to itself. It is not something that enables me to stand before God. In fact, it ensures me no place before God. And all it can do is attract God. If I put it this way, any form of asceticism not undertaken for the purpose will remain outside of the field of divine encounter. It will never enable me to receive God. My asceticism, therefore, must always take place in relation to God in order to attract God and draw him closer to me. And I attract God when I confess, by means of my asceticisms, my sinfulness and weakness and incapacity, when I acknowledge that on my own, I am absolutely unable to do anything spiritual. If I should receive divine contemplations, then my asceticism has followed meaning and makes me say, God, you gave me this experience of grace, this contemplation, but I am still who I am. I am earth, ash, clay, soil, flesh, naked, nothing at all. It is only you who make me rich. My life without you is like the world without light. Nothing has form or shape. Nothing is clearly visible. I can't see anything anywhere. Things vanish from before my eyes. They are lost, and I am lost without you. I find the substance of my being, the meaning of my life, only in the light of your grace. Only when you bestow upon me these spiritual insights and contemplations, which is the revelation of your presence, the contemplation and vision of you. Thus, it is through ascetic practice that I discover my identity. It is through asceticism that I come to recognize who I am, my nature, that I am earth and ash. I express my humble condition by being grateful for the gift that God has given me. And when God sees my gratitude, he is moved to give me even more. But asceticism by itself is not able to raise me up even a little bit above the earth if I do not have the experience of ongoing contemplations. Ascetic practice frees the mind only from licentiousness and hate. This is the limit of ascetic practices, namely the freedom from licentiousness and hate, which means to be in a state or condition in which one refrains from evil. Licentiousness is essentially a loss of control, a loss of the self, in which one is overpowered and dominated by the need to surrender to something, to not have control over it. To be freed from such a condition means that your mind returns to a state of self-governance so that it can protect itself and direct itself toward the proper goal, which is God. An example will be helpful. In monasticism, we have the virtue of virginity, which in its deeper sense is a perfect state of union with God. According to some people, the Greek word virginity actually means union or coupling with God. In the world, we have marriage, not sin, not fornication, but marriage, which is the freedom from licentiousness. Sin, on the other hand, is always a form of licentiousness. Marriage is many things, but in this context, it is a life that is measured, tempered, and balanced. It is something that requires self-restraint. In monasticism, we have virginity. In marriage, we have self-restraint. In the monastery, we do not own or acquire personal property. In marriage, there is proper and necessary use of personal property, but not greed, which again signals a loss of control, a form of licentiousness, for which there is never any justification, neither in monastic or married life. In married life, a person can be freed from licentiousness and passions, but he will nonetheless remain in the midst of worldly things. The complete liberation from such things is found only in the monastic life. As for the question of hate, we have already touched this in the second chapter when we spoke about desire. Hate is the opposite of desire. Desire attracts the mind, exerting some sort of magnetism on it to the extent that one likes or is drawn to something. Hate also inclines the mind in a certain way, but against something, so that we are opposed to or repelled by it. Freedom from licentiousness unites the mind with itself. It brings about an inner unification of our spiritual powers. Freedom from hate liberates the mind in every external element that either consumes it, makes it react, or places ourselves in opposition to it in the wrong way and for the wrong reasons. In other words, the mind needs to be simplified. It needs to rise above things and remain within itself, being neither attached to things nor repelled by them. Because if the mind is divided because of situations, circumstances, or people, if it is not inwardly united to the body of the church, and if it does not experience the communion of the church, then it cannot experience communion with God, but to the contrary falls away from such communion. Such a mind is separated from the body of Christ. But by means of ascetic practice, the mind is freed to turn to God, although, as we said, ascetic practice by itself is simply the beginning, a prerequisite to a presupposition. While spiritual contemplations rid it both of forgetfulness and ignorance. So again, we just focused that ascetic practices will free the mind only from licentiousness and hate, okay? And licentiousness, again, licentiousness is a loss of control, loss of the self, in which one is overpowered and dominated by a need to surrender to something. It's giving in. Okay, that's why we're in a great fast right now. It's one of the most powerful things I've ever heard an Orthodox priest say, and I can't remember the priest's name, but he was talking about why you fast. And again, this is your fast, right? You're fasting to your kind of focus, and you need to kind of, the idea is that it's yours. But the reason the priest said he fasted because he wanted to learn not to give in. And that's so strong. And of course, when you think about the 40-day fast of Christ, and just how much we're drawn to food and how much we're drawn to what we eat, and that's a form of licentiousness. And then hate is, again, the opposite of desire. So remember, the desire piece, it can move in good or bad, or it can move in good and evil, and it's you extending yourself towards something. And so again, that's you pushing out. But hate is the opposite of desire. Desire attracts the mind, but hate inclines the mind a certain way, but against something. Instead of bringing it to or reaching out to, you reach out against. And that's the difference between hate. So now we're going to that's what ascetic practice clears. Okay, licentiousness and hate. So to follow the commandments, to do what you're supposed to do, that's the only way to get rid of licentiousness and hate, or that's how you get rid of licentiousness and hate. And now we're on to spiritual contemplations. Spiritual contemplations rid the mind both of forgetfulness and ignorance. It is well known that for some reason, to attain a spiritual life, he must reach a level of forgetfulness and ignorance. He must forget, in other words, his own individual experience, his own way of seeing the world, the things he desires, and in short, he must forget whatever he has previously experienced. He must become ignorant of all things as if nothing existed for him. In this passage, however, the words forgetfulness and ignorance have a completely different meaning. Here, forgetfulness and ignorance signify forgetfulness and ignorance of God. To be free of such forgetfulness is in fact to recall or remember something, because forgetfulness separates a person from an experience. When I recall, for example, a time when I had fallen into sin, it means that the sin continues to live within me. Conversely, to forget the sin means that I no longer am in possession of it. I no longer have the experience of it. It is no longer active within me. In this way, forgetfulness is related to the knowledge based on experience. Thus, the person who has not reached contemplation has experiential ignorance of God. He has no feeling for God, but only complete forgetfulness. He has nothing, in other words, on the basis of which he might remember God, and what could he recall or remember if he has never seen God? If God has not revealed himself to him, if he has never experienced God's love or goodness with himself. I'm going to read that sentence again. If God has never revealed himself to him, if he has never experienced God's love or goodness within himself. Again, to be rid of such forgetfulness means to receive inner experiential knowledge. The phrase, to be rid of ignorance, means that spiritual reading and contemplation imbue the mind with knowledge. They make the mind participate in the life of God, granting it union with God. We therefore have two things: participation in God and experiential knowledge, that is, the understanding and comprehension of God, who becomes an inseparable part of my being. And it is indeed through my mind, through reconciliation, because it is through the mind that I am united with God. Asceticism assists our mind remaining undistracted by its own inner movements and by the things outside of itself. Contemplation, on the other hand, assists not only in preserving the undistracted state of mind, but unites the mind with God. The result is that the mind will be able to pray as it ought. The mind will be able to pray as it ought. Union and acquaintance with God, or walking together with God, which is the direct and immediate apprehension of God, enable the human person to pray in a manner consistent with the teachings of the fathers and of the church. This means that prayer becomes communion with God, the rapture of the mind and the union with him. When this happens, the person seems to be living in this world, but in reality is living in heaven. So this past Sunday, we celebrated St. Mary of Egypt, and the story of St. Mary of Egypt reflects a lot of this chapter. She was deeply in love with sexual intercourse, and as a young woman growing up in the city of Alexandria, which was both it's incredibly similar to the way the world is now. It's both a beautiful city where God was doing a whole lot of things, but it was also kind of a party town. And she got on a boat to go to I believe it was the elevation of the Holy Cross at the Holy Sepulchre. So the cross of Christ was being taken to the Sepulchre, the Church of the Sepulchre. And there was a ship going to the Holy Land from Alexandria, and she got on it, but not to go see the cross. She got on it to go chase dudes. And so she did that. And the story goes, as she came into the church, or tried to enter the church, she couldn't. And she tried 3 times, and I think something like she fell to her knees. And then she saw the Holy Theotokos. She saw the Virgin Mary, and I think an icon, or she had a vision of her. And finally, she kind of repented. And she changed her mind. And again, to be rid of ignorance, spiritual reading and contemplation imbue the mind with the knowledge. They're able to participate in the life of God, granting it union with God, participation with God, and spiritual knowledge. And that experience for her, gave her what she eventually kind of was baptized, and received Holy Communion, and then lived 40-something years in prayer and contemplation, getting rid of her sins, and lived in the desert for 40-something years, and finally was given Holy Communion one more time by a priest who kind of had a different way. He always thought that he was better than everybody else and fully committed to the ascetic practices. And he encountered Saint Mary of Egypt, who was the exact opposite. And she had given herself just to spiritual contemplations and had rejected the ascetic practices. And of course, she had participated in them while she was in the desert. But the monk who was going to give her Holy Communion, he said that he knew just that she was in direct contact with God. The story does go that she actually, once they met for the monk to give her Holy Communion, that she was able to walk across the Jordan River. And so she was directly connected with God because of both of her ascetic practice and her spiritual contemplations for 40 years. 40 years just actively carrying out kind of the ridding of the passions. And so may Saint Mary of Egypt, kind of as we go through our fast, may she continue to pray for us and give us strength as we go through this. And next time, in terms, Maximus is going to take us to greater heights. And he told us how we would be enslaved to material things, what could liberate us. We keep the commandments that deliver us from the states, and we obtain through spiritual reading and contemplation. And now he returns to the question of prayer, because prayer has a direct and immediate relation to love. He's already told us about the activity of prayer among those on a level of practice and again on the level of contemplation. Now he tells us the heights that prayer reaches when it is offered from each of these in two ways. So this is the next text on love. There are two supreme states of pure prayer. One corresponding to those pursuing the practical life, the other to those who experience contemplation. The first arises from the soul, from the fear of God and good hope. The second from desire from God and for total purification. So I look forward to reading that, hopefully in the coming days. Hope everybody is doing well. We're starting week 4 of quarantine. I think we've been at this now for 3 weeks tomorrow, so we'll be beginning the 4th week. So that's where we are. I think today it's April 6th. So hope all of you have a good day. Hope you've enjoyed listening, and we'll talk to you soon.